literature and Latinx literature and theater. So this is the perfect book for me, and I'm very excited. So I think we'll go next, and I'll let Ruth, who's coming in from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where she is professor of anthropology, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. This is so lovely, and I'm so glad to have the opportunity to meet many of you in this way and talk about Lucky Broken Girl. So as Carolina said, I'm an anthropologist at the University of Michigan, where I've been for many years as a cultural anthropologist, but I've always been very interested in writing and expressing myself in different genres. So I write ethnography as an anthropologist, and I've done a lot of work researching in Spain, Mexico, and Cuba, where I was born. But I've always had very strong literary interests as well, and have been writing personal essays and stories for a long time, as well as poetry. I have a book, a bilingual book of poems that came out last year. And Lucky Broken Girl is my first novel, my first work of fiction, and also my debut novel for kids. So it's my first effort to move into children's literature, and I'm really thrilled I've been able to do it. I'm really loving it. So thank you.
And as Denise said, we will reserve the last 10 minutes for questions, but I think Ruth and I discussed earlier that if we are talking about something, and if you have a question, just put it up on the chat, and if we feel like it's appropriate for that conversation, we'll entertain questions as we're going along as well. But you're also welcome to just kind of sit back, listen, jot down your questions, and then we can go over them in the last 10 minutes. And this is going to be, in that way it'll be interactive, but this will just be a conversation between Ruth and I about, Ruth and me about her book. And I'm going to start basically with the question. This book is semi-autobiographical. So my question for you is why did you decide to tell this story now, and why did you choose this format, right? And this audience?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think all of us have stories that we carry around for a long time. And this was a story I had definitely carried around for a very long time. All of these, the autobiographical part of the story, the events that happened took place, 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And as I was, when I was about 10 years old, and as I was approaching the age of 60, for some reason, the experience started coming back to me in these like almost little snapshots, little memory snapshots, and I started writing them down. I had thought about the experience many, many times. I've written about Cuban identity and being Cuban. Those are all things I've written about in a prose nonfiction format. And I had once also tried to write about this experience of the car accident and the incidents that I detail in Lucky Broken Girl. I had written about them in my book, The Vulnerable Observer, in a personal essay. But what I hadn't done was to put myself in the body of that little girl and be Ruthie again. That was something that I had not done, actually just be that girl. And someone had suggested it to me, like, why don't you write this story from the girl's perspective, from this 10-year-old girl's perspective? And I had thought about it for a long time and just kept putting it off because I had so many other things to do in my life as an anthropologist. And then I just started writing it down. It just came back to me for totally mysterious reasons. And I just started writing it. I think one thing that helped is I have a writing buddy that I meet with periodically in Ann Arbor, and she was doing a lot of fiction writing. She's a psychologist, but she also writes fiction. And I, and I was thinking, I'm not keeping up with her. She's writing so much, and I can't seem to keep up with my friend. And then the story started coming out, and I shared it with my friend Anne. And she said, this is good. You should keep going with this. And it was enough of a push to make me keep going till I had, the first draft of the story, all of these little memory snapshots, little vignettes, little episodes in my life when I was 10, just remembering not just me, but my family and kind of everybody who was around me at that time, and trying to see it all from the girl's perspective. So that's how it got started. I had always wanted to write fiction, and I had dabbled in fiction on many occasions, but this is my first effort to really hang in there and try to write a long piece of fiction.
And what for you was, well, how did your background in ethnography and cultural anthropology inform this book?
I think it informed it in many positive ways. You know, we're so interested in diversity and inclusion now, and those are all issues I had thought about for many years as an anthropologist working in different parts of the world, thinking about whose stories are we telling and why do we have the right to tell certain stories and not others. And so I'd been thinking about all of those issues, about the politics of storytelling. I had been thinking about diversity. Of course, I'd been thinking about Cuba, and I had done a lot of research in Cuba, on the Jewish community in Cuba, but also on literature in Cuba. I had edited a book called Bridges to Cuba, and I had collected just a lot of information and a lot of stories about the Cuban experience, both on the island and in the diaspora. So I had all of that background from ethnography, from anthropology, and I realized that the one thing I really had not done was write about my own immigrant experience. I had spent a lot of time traveling to Cuba and getting to know the island. What was this place where I was born that my family chose to leave behind? So I had all of this knowledge of the island, but I really hadn't spent much time thinking about what was it like to be a kid growing up, in New York as a Cuban immigrant child. I hadn't really put a lot of attention on that, and Lucky Broken Girl was an effort to think through that experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to tell you, I have to appreciate. I am not an expert in this book is for young readers, 10 and over. But as an adult reading it, and as someone who studies Latinx literature, and particularly Cuban American and Cuban exile literature, I appreciated the levels of. I mean, you tackle all sorts of things. We have gender and linguistic, language, politics. We have death. We have divorce, disability, right? Immigration, biculturalism, exile, religion, spirituality, trauma, the arts, right? So I think it was rich with all these themes and topics, and I think that's what's great about the book is how it's for a wide audience for sure. And I want to start with Ruthie. So let's talk about Ruthie. As you said, this is kind of based on your experience. We see the entire world, this entire world that's created in 1960s New York, Queens, through Ruthie's eyes, and kind of like, and you said it's semi-autobiographical. What was challenging about writing Ruthie for you?
Well, many things were challenging, to make her an interesting character. Number one, it's all going to be told through Ruthie. So Ruthie better be interesting to the reader. And thinking that, at first when I was writing it, I wasn't sure that it was going to be children's literature. All I knew was that it was the 10-year-old girl's perspective. So that was as far as I got. But when I got to the end, I said, this is a book for kids. I'm writing this book for kids. That became really clear to me. So the challenge was, how do I make her interesting? And especially, and this was an issue when I first showed it to a couple of editors. They said, well, we don't know if kids are going to be interested in reading about a girl who has to be in bed for a year. Are kids going to be interested in this disability story? As you said, there isn't enough action. She's not moving around. She's in her room. She's in bed for a year. She's reading books. How is that going to be interesting to kids? So that was my challenge. How do you make this interesting so kids will want to read this book? So as I worked on the revisions, I thought more and more about it and realized that as an anthropologist, I had taken all of these journeys, these real journeys to real places all over the world. And then I thought about how Ruthie was taking a journey too. She didn't leave her bed, but she was taking a journey of the heart, of the mind, of the soul. So it was another way to take a journey without actually moving, since she couldn't move, but she was still journeying. She was still growing. She was expanding. Her mind, her heart were expanding and growing during this time of being bedridden. And that's what I started realizing as I was writing, as I was revising especially, that yes, this could be interesting to kids, because kids would think about that and would think about this other kind of journey. The internal journey is as much a journey as the external. journey. And so that was the challenge, making Ruthie interesting, staying in her head, you know, remembering that it's her voice, it's how she sees things. You know, they may be wrong, they may be naive, they may have all kinds of flaws, but this is how she thinks. This is her head, and I had to realize that it was me and it wasn't me. I think of Ruthie in the book as a better version of me as a child. She's a lot wiser, she's smarter, she's thoughtful, she's also expressive, and so it was me, but it was also not me, and it was kind of figuring out how to create that character that had a lot in common with me, but that could also be herself.
Well, I mean, now that you say that it wasn't until towards the end that you decided this should be a children's novel or a young, you know, children's literature, is because Ruthie, I mean, you allow Ruthie to feel this plethora of emotions, right? Depression, envy, anger, fear, frustration, hate, you know, that the stone in my heart, and
Yeah.
trying to for her to feel all those things. Well, and also other characters, and we'll get to this later. I mean, all your characters, you allow them to express pain. So how did you balance? Well, number one, was it hard to continue to make Ruthie likable? Right? Because at times, you know, even when she was trying to walk again, right? I was getting so frustrated with her. I was like, just walk. What are you doing? Right. But still she comes out very likable. And was that a challenge to allow her to express all these emotions and her still be like this heroic figure in a way in this world?
Yeah, I don't think I was thinking that she'd be heroic, but I definitely wanted to show her complexity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to show all the fears. And a lot of those elements were very true to what I remembered about myself. I remembered that, you know, being in the cast was horrible and the whole family was exasperated. Like, when is this girl going to get better finally? And I could feel that exasperation of everybody around me. And then when the cast came off, and of course, you know, I mean, they wanted the best for me. My family did, but the cast came off and it was like, okay, start walking, you know. And, you know, but when you've not walked for a year, it's very hard to suddenly walk again. You know, the muscles are atrophied, you're weak, you don't even remember how to walk. You have to intellectually tell yourself how to walk. And I remember, you know, having been taught to walk, and it was like I had to understand it intellectually. Okay, you bend a knee, you straighten the other leg, you move forward. I mean, I didn't know, it's not like a baby that, you know, you learn to walk as a baby, you crawl and then you walk, and, you know, you're doing all this when you're a year old. But when you're 10, you know, you have to do it intellectually. So I remember how exasperated everybody was around me. So those emotions were very real, and they were things I remembered from my own experience. But I did want Ruthie to have a whole spectrum of emotions, so that the reader could see that she was a very real person, right? That at times she was sad and depressed and angry and hopeless, but then other times she was naive and, you know, dreamy. And I mean, so I wanted to show that whole spectrum of emotions. And I also wanted every character in the book to have that complexity as well, even the most minor characters. And one of the minor characters is Neela, the nurse in the hospital.
That's one of my examples I was going to ask you about. Yes.
Yeah, so that's a character that I thought a lot about, because I remembered from childhood that there had been a mean nurse. That was all I remembered. There was a mean nurse. I thought, why was she so mean? And when I was writing, initially she was just a mean nurse. And as I went back over that part of the text, I said, wait a minute, I need to know why she's mean. People aren't mean for no reason. Something must have happened to Neela. And just even figuring out that her name would be Neela, giving her a history, giving her a story, finding out what her sorrow was, and that she wasn't really mean, she was just sad. And then she shares that with Ruthie, and that makes Ruthie develop more empathy as well. And so that was what I wanted. When kind of that clicked for me with Neela, I realized that I had to try to do that for every character. So we have that with Izzy, with, you know, the little brother who can be kind of annoying and coming in with his Chips Ahoy's cookies, when Ruthie can't have any cookies. And so he's like this annoying little brother. But at the same time, we find out that he's trying to do his best. He's just a little kid. He's dealing with a sister who has to be in bed. He's not getting any attention. He's also suffered and has all these stitches in his head, and nobody's paying any attention to him. And so giving him his, moment as well in the story. And that was what I realized as I was writing, that I had to think of each character as a full human being with a story. And even if they were just going to be on the page very briefly, we had to feel that each of them was a complete person with a story. And that's how I think about human beings in general. I think coming from anthropology, I'm so used to thinking everybody has a story. If there were enough time, I could record everybody's story. Everybody's interesting, and kind of, having that sensibility. And I think I felt that with my characters. They were all interesting. They were all complex. Mommy in the story is also very complex. I mean, she's a young, beautiful mother, recently arrived from Cuba. All she wants to do is dress up in her high heels and, her pretty clothing and everything. And here she's got to take care of this girl in bed. And so thinking about her too, and, the complexity of having to be a mother in that kind of caretaking role. So each character, I just thought about each character and what each character was facing in the course of the story.
And I have this down here. I was like, they all have stories to tell, is what I said. They all share some kind of pain. And you talk about, for a long time, it was wrong for you to talk about pain. There's a long time you didn't process this whole experience. And I think it's interesting how each of these characters have pain, and you let them show this pain, and they're all negotiating and reconciling it in these beautiful ways. And I really also think this is people say I'm sorry a lot in this book. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm sorry for being mean to you, or I'm sorry, I'm just frustrated. And I want to know, I mean, it's like a book of forgiveness, right? It's a manual on how to forgive, right? And how to listen and how to forgive. And I'm wondering, was that on purpose or I think it's a wonderful lesson, to be learned. Absolutely. But if you have any comments about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's such a great question. It was a deep theme in the story that I was thinking about, because in fact, I did remember as a child being very angry at the boys that caused the accident, or that was how I thought about it at the time. And I remember all of this childish anger, kind of thinking, why did they do this? Why were they so reckless? Why did they not care enough about their own lives? Why did they get drunk? All of those questions that I tried to understand as a child. And I remember being very angry and trying to understand like who to blame for what had happened, and this is the kind of thing. It's such a human thing to want to know who's responsible, who caused this, as opposed to thinking it might have been random or something like that. We want to lay blame somewhere. And I remember as a child having that anger. And as I was writing, I was thinking there has to be a moment when this child can let go of her anger and can realize that, yes, it's too bad this happened, but she can't be angry at these boys anymore. They died. They lost their lives. Mm-hmm. And then I started thinking that she would care about them, after they've died, that she would think about them, that she would want to know their names. And that's also a very Jewish thing as well, that you name people, you name the dead, and by naming the dead, you remember them so they're not lost. And so I thought about that and the importance of the names. And so that's a fictional moment in the story, because I don't think in real life that I did that, but much later in life I did want to know more about who were these guys that unfortunately died in this accident, and feeling that the forgiveness was really important. And it is a really important theme in the book, that until Ruthie can forgive those boys, she can't really heal completely. The part of the healing that has to happen is not just her leg has to heal, but she has to heal from the accident and from all the misery that she's been through, and all of her fears and
all of her
difficult emotions. Yeah. So that without that forgiveness, the forgiveness has to begin inside, so that then she can, start to heal on the outside too. As I was writing, I realized that that was going to be an important theme in the story. And she, to some extent, has to forgive herself as well, and and realize that that things are going to change, that she's not going to be the same Ruthie that she was before the accident. So she has to sort of forgive herself and realize that that's okay, that we do change and we have to accept, some of the things that life, throws in our direction, and sort of forgive ourselves as well if we can't be the things that we thought we were going to be, but maybe we're going to be something else. So that kind of self-forgiveness was important too, and also I think gaining some empathy for what her parents were going through as well, and how difficult this was for them and the rest of the family. For Ruthie to come to some sort of consciousness about that too, that's also a kind of forgiveness.
Great. So we have a question here, and this leads us right into my next topic, which is the topic of kind of immigration, immigrants, and exile. And Rosa just in the chat asked, how did your family arrive in the U.S.? So if Ruth, would you like to talk a little bit about that before we go into the Mizrahi family in Lucky Brook?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So we left Cuba soon after the revolution in 61, and it was right after the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 61. And so the U.S. Embassy had closed, and my parents didn't have passports. They were very young. They were 25 and 27 years old, and they already had two children, myself and my younger brother. And my father essentially made the decision that we needed to leave Cuba. It was, after the invasion, that was when Fidel Castro announced that Cuba was going to move in a communist direction and align itself with the former Soviet Union. And my father essentially made this decision, we can't stay here. And my mother was like, no, I don't want to go. I love Cuba. And, and she remembers crying all night before we left. But we ended up leaving, interestingly, via Israel. Because my parents didn't have passports, they didn't have a way to come directly to the United States, and we went to Israel where we had some family. We actually had a great uncle who was the co-founder of a kibbutz in Israel, which I always thought was very funny, that we were escaping one form of communism in Cuba and then going to an agricultural commune in Israel. And that was where we went. And we were there, with the intention of staying. My parents thought they were going to stay there. And then after a year, most of my mother's family had moved to New York, because I have an aunt, as in the book, my Aunt Sylvia, who married an Americano, who married an American guy from New York. And so the family had basically resettled in New York by 1962. And so my parents decided to move to New York and be with the rest of the family. So we got to New York at that time and moved to Queens, just as in the book. We settled in Queens, and this very working class and immigrant neighborhood known as Briarwood or Jamaica, Queens. And just as in the book, there were people from all over the world living in that neighborhood. I've been back to the neighborhood. I've been back to my old school, to PS 117. I was there last May, and it was the most amazing experience. 30 different languages are spoken in my old public school. So it was a school of immigrants back then, but now even more so. So I grew up, I think growing up in New York made me a particular kind of immigrant. I didn't grow up in Miami with the Cuban community in Miami. I grew up with this other Cuban community in New York. So I was with other Cubans all the time in New York, friends of my family, friends of my parents, people that they knew from Cuba who had also gone to New York. But also there were all the other immigrant groups, around us, and Latinos and Latinas of other backgrounds, Puerto Rican and Dominican and so on. So I think that really informed my, my sense of myself as an immigrant, that, that I was Latina, but there were also other kinds of immigrants around us too.
Right. Well, yes, when I made a list of all your characters, and they're all from somewhere else, right?
Most of them, yeah.
Yes, and even Clay, the ambulance driver, right? He's from the South, right? So they're all like migrating from somewhere else.
Yeah.
To the city. And one of the things, and you said, so this is the first time you've talked about your experience as a Cuban immigrant in a fictional way, and I really appreciated the way my parents are also Cuban exiles, and I loved the way seeing through Ruthie's eyes that process of immigration slash exile, right? Which gives it another aspect, and the tension between the parents, that she would notice, the gender dynamics, right? There's definitely some machismo going on there, absolutely. That I was that not only that I recognized, but I thought it was so interesting that you would include that in this book, and but I think it's important to do so. And your mother's, the sad, like your mother was sad all the time, right? Like you talk about her sadness. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what my question is, but I thought that was beautiful and very realistic. And did you at any point any point think that maybe you need to lighten that up a little bit? Because I even felt uncomfortable. Sometimes I was reading, I was like, well, that's uncomfortable. Like what she would notice and observe, I'd be like, oh, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable. Perhaps because I remember noticing those things when I was growing up as well, that tension, the sadness. But including that did you feel like it had to be there for it to be that story?
I think so. I was trying to show different immigrant perspectives. So, I wanted the very nostalgic mother who's looking back to Cuba, who's having trouble adjusting, and some of those things were true of my mother, but also thinking of other mothers that were sad, that left so much behind. And suddenly, especially New York, which is so different, say, from Miami, where you would have had the tropical breezes and the palm trees. New York can be, in the winter can be so gray. So, so thinking of this mother that is feeling so nostalgic, who's having such a hard time adjusting, who's at home all the time because she's not working, so she's not developing relationships with other people, and so she's at home, and which also leads her to think more about everything that's been lost. So I was thinking about a character like that and contrasting her with her husband, with the father, with Papi. And Papi's more like, I want to move forward. He's the kind of immigrant that like, okay, let's leave the past behind.
Forget it all what we left behind. Exactly. This is the land.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's pretty much what my father was like. And it was like, let's just move forward. Forget it. Okay. We just have to move forward. We don't have time to be thinking about the past. That chapter is over. So I wanted to show the clash of those perspectives and the story. So even within the family, within the parents, there's a clash in how to be an immigrant. And then I wanted to contrast them to all the other immigrants, to Ramu, Ruthie's friend from India, Danielle from Belgium. So there's these different ways to be an immigrant. There isn't one way to be an immigrant or to be an immigrant child. So I wanted to show that, and I thought it would be interesting if the parents contrasted, because I remembered in real life my own parents having these contrasting perspectives, and my mother was always the one that tried to stay in touch with people in Cuba. And in fact, one of the things that I brought into the novel was she's corresponding with Caro, who was Ruthie's former nanny. I actually just wrote an essay about the real Caro because she just passed away in December at the age of 93, and she was like a second mother to me. And it was in fact on these various trips to Cuba that I found out that she had learned about the car accident through a cousin of mine that had written to her. And she had gone and made this pilgrimage to San Lázaro, to the shrine of St. Lazarus, on my behalf, so that I would heal. And she told me this whole story. And I thought, oh my God, that is such a beautiful story, that this woman in Cuba had, been concerned about me as a child. And so I was able to wrap that, into the novel and make it be a story that she's sharing with Ruthie's mother, because Ruthie's mother is still corresponding with her. And in fact, my mother did continue to stay in touch via letters with Caro, who had been, a nanny, but she had become really a close friend of my mother's as well. And so So yeah, so I just wanted those elements to be there. These some very realistic elements, and showing the different ways in which people connect or disconnect from their home countries. So the way Papi, the father, says, "Okay, I'm done with Cuba, disconnecting," but yet he's very Cuban in the machismo and in certain aspects of his temperament. And Mommy's the one that wants to stay connected and feels that she can still stay connected to Cuba, even as she starts, with hesitation, creating this new life for herself in the United States.
And I don't want to go away. I want to stick with your family, but I'm also interested, well, the different ways of being immigrants, right? And you have Chicho, the Mexican, right? This kind of whimsical character who is this amazing character, but let's get back to him in just a second. I have a question about the presence of religion, the family's religion. First, the Judaism, and that's something that's not explicitly stated until further in the novel. There's hints here and there, but you don't explicitly state it until later. And then Ruthie's kind of religious / spiritual journey as well, when she's writing these, her prayers, right? And first it's to God, and then it's we have Shiva, and then we have Frida Kahlo. And then, San Lázaro and Babaluaye. So what I would like your thoughts on this kind of her spiritual journey. Number one, waiting to represent the Judaism, right? In that way, explicitly, like taking your time, not in giving kind of hints here and there before it's said. I mean, I think that you talk about your grandparents speaking Yiddish before you even mentioned the word Judaism, and I thought that was wonderful. And really an interesting choice. And then her spiritual journey, including all these different religions.
Yeah, well, this is great. So I mean, she is shown to be a secular Jewish girl. So she knows she's Jewish, but she's also very Cuban. And so she's very open to different religious and spiritual traditions. So I wanted to show a child who isn't fixed in a position. I went to public school in New York. In Cuba, I briefly went to a Jewish day school. And had we stayed in Cuba, had the revolution not happened, had, another course of history taken place, I would have gone to a school in Cuba where I was being taught in Spanish and Yiddish. That was the schooling that I was getting in Cuba. That was the schooling that my mother had gotten in Cuba. And so it would have been, of course, completely different from the schooling I received in New York. Some of my parents' friends had more money, and they sent their kids to Jewish day schools in New York, to yeshivas. And so all of those kids had a very strong sense of themselves as Jewish, as primarily Jewish, strongly Jewish. But I, going to public school and being around kids of different backgrounds, had a much more fluid sense of my Jewishness. It may also have been me, that I was just curious about other people and what they believed and what they thought, was God and what they thought was spiritual. So I wanted to create a character in Ruthie who was open to these different religious traditions, who wasn't fixed in her Judaism, who knows she's Jewish. And she asks her mother, in fact, in that very scene where the mother is telling her about Caro going on this pilgrimage to the San Lázaro shrine, and she's asking, her mother, well, can we accept this since we're Jewish? And then her mother says, well, anything that's done in good faith, we should accept it. It was done in good faith on your behalf. And so I wanted to show that kind of tolerance and that openness, but also the idea that Ruthie is dealing with such a hard time in her life, and she kind of needs all the help she can get. So she's writing these letters to God, but then when she learns about Shiva, she thinks, well, maybe Shiva can help her too. And then when she learns about Frida Kahlo is a kind of, diosa, she's a kind of goddess. At this point, she's a heroine of like an artist who's disabled and disabled but abled at the same time, to create this amazing art. So I wanted Ruthie to be open to the possibility of different spirit guides that might help her to get better. And but it really all started with the idea of the doctor saying to her, like the doctor himself admitting that he didn't have a guarantee that she would heal and that she would be better again. So that even the doctor who's doing his very best and following science and rationality to try to heal this child, even he isn't absolutely sure, right? You can't guarantee that somebody's going to heal perfectly. So when the doctor says, pray to God and all the saints, Ruthie goes, well, I better start praying. And she's not a girl that typically prays, and she's not even sure how to pray, but she starts communicating these prayers. And so it just, for me, it became also kind of an essential part of the story, this spiritual part, and kind of coming to an understanding that we don't have control over everything, and that sometimes we really do have to rely on spirits and spirit guides, to help us in difficult times. So I wanted to show that from a kid's perspective, and particularly a child, in this case, a young person, Ruthie, who's open to these different traditions, and she's noticing that different kinds of people want to help her. Chicho wants to help her through art, and Ramu gives her the necklace with Shiva, and so they're each trying to do something to help her, and she's accepting all of that goodness that is sort of coming her way, all of these good wishes in a sense for her.
Okay. And so let's talk about a little bit about, you mentioned earlier, and that when you were showing this book, a lot of people are like, well, there's not enough action going on. But as we mentioned before, these characters that are coming in and out of Ruthie's life, Ruthie, the way she processes her emotions and talks about her emotions, her interactions with people, and one of the characters that basically turns everything around is Chicho, right, and brings art into her life. But at the same time, I feel like Chicho is capable, he does something for Ruthie that her parents were not able to do, right? Like he turned the bed around, he takes her out, like he's very creative, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about that, what his role is and how you came up with that character. Like, how did you decide to put him in there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A couple of things. We had a neighbor similar to Chicho. I mean, Chicho is an expanded character, but we had a neighbor who was very artsy and, hung out a lot with my parents and would come over for cafecito and so on. And, and he was artsy. He got my father to make some little paintings. And so I remembered this person and I thought, he's got to be in the story too. And, so he just sort of developed as I was figuring out that last part of the novel, and I thought, what if there's a neighbor like Chicho who is, different, artsy, who's also an immigrant, but a different kind of immigrant. He's looking for a certain freedom that he didn't have in Mexico, to be artsy, to be himself. And so I wanted some of that exuberance to be there as well, and to have the exuberance of an artist be there. And in fact, in real life, my bed never did get moved. It stayed in one position the whole time, and I was never able to look out the window. And so that was where I moved into fiction. And I thought, well, what if there's somebody that moves the bed, and somebody that thinks of all of these creative things that can happen to make Ruthie's life a little sweeter during this difficult time. So Chicho just developed very organically, again, from this neighbor that I remembered, but that I really expanded him as a person in the story. So yeah, I guess it was the idea that your parents can't always resolve all your problems. They're dealing with enough things as it is, just like coping, with the injury and the legal issues. I mean, everything that my parents must have been, or that parents would have been coping.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So that sometimes you need to have an outsider, a stranger, somebody who can kind of see the situation more objectively and think of like how to make things better for this child. So it happened very organically. I mean, I don't think I had it like very planned, but it just, it just developed, particularly after I realized that Ramu and Avik would be leaving after Avik's death, that they would go back to India. And that was based on, we had, the sad thing is that there really was a boy from India who died, who fell out of a window. So that part was true in the story. But there was also a Japanese boy that had been a friend of mine in first and second grade, and then that family ended up going back to Japan. So I always thought about how, well, they could go back, but we couldn't go back to Cuba. So I had kind of kept that in my mind. And then in the story, once I realized that the family from India would be going back to India after the death of Avik, and the apartment would be open again, and that's when I realized, oh well, of course that's where Chicho's going to live, and kind of it all came together. And that character was so much fun to develop and to think about, and for him to have piñatas hanging from the ceiling in his apartment. I mean, that part wasn't true. That part was me creating a fable. And I thought, wouldn't that have been wonderful if there was a neighbor who had piñatas? Like what kid wouldn't like to go into an apartment just filled with piñatas and then throwing confetti? I just thought, there'd be this like very exuberant, very artsy, fun character that would open up another world for her.
So did you read any young adults or young reader novels before taking this on, or before deciding how you wanted to approach this, or after completing it and being like, how can I mold this more into that?
Yeah, that's great. Well, a combination of both. So this novel is classified as middle grade, because there are these different categories. There's like children's books or picture books. There's beginning chapter books. There's middle grade, that is essentially ages 10 to 12, this kind of preteen group. And then there's YA. And then I think within YA, there's different categories as well. And YA can go like to age 19 and 20, these days. So the YA category has also really expanded in interesting ways. But with my character, she's meant to be 10 years old, like really at the beginning of middle grade. Though some younger kids, some 8-year-old kids have read my book, and then some older kids, and then a lot of adults have read it too. So what was the question? I'm sorry, where was I going with this?
You had read anything to kind of prepare?
Had I read? Yeah. So I had read some books. One of the major books that had a big influence on me was Brown Girl Dreaming by Jackie Woodson, and that's a verse novel, and I really loved it. It's a very middle grade novel, and it's also about immigration, in that it's about a girl who migrates with her family from the South to New York, so kind of similar to Clay's story that you mentioned before. And I just loved that book and really related to it, even though it's different. It's an African-American story, but I really related to it, thought it was so beautiful, and that was a big inspiration. I had read Margarita Engel's book. She's also Cuban American and she's a very prolific author, and has written many, many books for kids. She's written picture books and also lots of middle grade books, and most of them in verse, so verse fiction or verse novels. So I had read her work and was familiar with her work. I had also read, it's a little older than middle grade, but it's a book I love, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And so that was a book that I was thinking about, and the New York aspect of the story as well. And so that was an influence. So I had read some books. I was definitely somewhat familiar. I mean, I wasn't an expert, but I was definitely somewhat familiar with literature for kids. And then as I was revising, especially, I began to read more and to understand the age a little bit better and understand more about the literature. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, I mean, that's middle grade, and an amazing book. I read that. So a lot of books that I was reading either right before or as I was writing or as I was revising. And then of course read a lot more afterwards, once I realized I was like jumping into this world, and there's still so much more that I need to read. I've kind of just landed in this amazing world of kids' books. And the funny thing is that my editor said that I had gotten the 10-year-old voice so perfectly. She said, you really were able to get the voice of that age group. And she said, how did you do it? And I said, well, I remember being 10 so vividly because it was the year I was in the cast. And I was in bed, and I could never forget what that felt like. And so I guess when I think of childhood, I think of that period in particular, that 9, 10, 11-year-old period, because it was just such a vivid time. So much changed in my life. And so now I'm writing another novel, and it's also about a slightly older girl who's 12, but that period and that voice seems to come somewhat naturally to me because it was such an important moment in my life.
Right. And also the transition, right? Like Ruthie in the book, at least, is she's making the transition between immigrant to, or like Cuban to Cuban American, right? And like she's making that transition. She's fully bilingual. She's dancing to or singing Nancy Sinatra, you know, these boots are made for walking, right? Like she's, and I think that's an important time for sure, a memorable time for sure. And including not just, you know, in terms of growing up and not just, and then having the accident at the same time, this all kind of coincided, all sorts of identity changes, evolution going on and right.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure. So all of that is coming together in some way. All of those changes. I mean, that's a period in our lives as kids where so much is happening, that preteen moment, we're putting so much together. You know, we're still in a child's body, but our minds are kind of way, way ahead of our bodies. And, you know, I was actually just speaking at a school today here in Ann Arbor, and just, you know, being with sixth graders and seeing that very relationship, that sort of sharpness of their brains, but they're still in these childish bodies, and, you know, and very concerned with mature issues, but still kids, you know, and so it is such an incredibly fluid time in our lives, a time of so much transition. So if you add the fact that just naturally, biologically, we're going through such a transition at that time, and then if on top of it you have an injury, right, it really demarcates that
and
time for you.
Also geographically, right? You're no longer in your home country, and the precariousness of the whole moment.
Yeah, exactly. The vulnerability of it, right? That, you know, home has been lost. This family has to create a new home. So they're just trying to do that, which is so difficult. And as they're trying to do that, this other obstacle comes, you know, in their way. There's a car accident. There's a girl that needs to be taken care of, right? They need to figure out her health care, how to pay for bills, how to do everything. And that's what I thought about as I was writing the book. I really felt that I had been lacking empathy for everything that my family went through. I didn't understand it at the time. And looking back 50 years later and just thinking, what could that have been like for my parents to have just arrived from Cuba, and now their daughter is in a body cast and they have to figure out, you know, how they're going to take care of her. Is she going to get better? And what that must have been like for them, how scared and worried they must have been, and not understanding that myself as a child at the time, just kind of suffering through that, and realizing that for them, you know, now, you know, with all of this hindsight, realizing that for them, that must have been just such a grueling time for the whole family. I mean, my whole family remembers that so vividly, and they remember how much I changed after the accident, that I really did become a different girl. They all remember that. They'll say that to me. Yeah, that's when you started really reading a lot, and you know, becoming this little scholar. And, you know, so it was a moment of change, but it was a moment of trauma in a sense for the whole family.
Right. Okay, Ruth, we're going to go on to, we have several questions here. I'm going to go, the first one is, did you ever consider writing the story in verse after you talked about these other books that you read?
You know, I did, I think I thought about it for a moment, but that probably was even more challenging than what I took on. But I would like to write a novel in verse someday. I mean, I love Margarita Engel's, you know, novels in verse, and Jackie Woodson's and others that I've read. I think they're so beautiful.
Mm-hmm. The next question is from Rosa. She wants to know if you have any of the artwork you created while in bed saved.
My mother may have some things, because my mother has saved a lot of things from my childhood. So she may have a couple of things that I made at that time, or that I made in school subsequently. But I myself don't really have any of that. I decided at some point, a little bit older, that I wasn't really a good visual artist, and started focusing more on writing and keeping a diary and writing poems as a kid. So I also liked music, and I had played the violin and the guitar. So I was kind of exploring different arts. And at some point around high school, I decided that I was more of a writer than anything else. Though I continued taking guitar when I was in college. I would play Spanish guitar. But the art I pretty much left behind. I didn't think I was good enough to do art, but I did take up photography.
Okay, great. Well, I love the, you know, how, and I think you talk about this at the end of your book, like the art as therapy, right? And the importance of art.
Very much. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And so this is from Karen. This is a detail, but a repeated detail in the novel, full of such a rich detail about characters. So I'll raise my concern about the frequent references to the dumb class. And that's certainly what kids called those classes both in the 1960s and unfortunately today too. Is there be any responsibility would deal with such terms in the context of the story so it doesn't continue to normalize these demeaning references?
Yeah, I tried to be very self-conscious about that. It really just comes up at the very beginning of the book. I don't know that it really moves through the rest of the novel, but at the very beginning. And I felt that it had to be there because it was definitely an experience that I was put through. I was in the dumb class, quote unquote dumb class myself, and remember that
as well. I was placed in the dumb class as well when I was.
Yeah, so I think it was an experience that a lot of us went through, and I didn't want to sanitize it and pretend that it hadn't existed, or that that term hadn't been used by the kids themselves to classify themselves. So I felt it had to be there as a form of historical truth. I certainly don't want to normalize it by any means. And whenever I talk about it, I always explain to kids that of course nobody was dumb, and that, you know, that wasn't the thing to take away from it, that it was a term that, you know, that was used by the kids themselves because we felt inferior because we didn't know English. We were made to feel that we were inferior because we didn't know English. And I always point out that fortunately we now have English as a second language. We have all these programs to support kids who speak other languages, and that now we also, at least most of us, appreciate bilingualism or trilingualism, that actually it's a benefit if you can speak more than one language, that you know, that is so great for us as citizens of the world. And later on in the book, you know, Ruthie comes to realize that it's good to be bilingual when she's with her teacher, Joy. And, you know, they're talking about knowing two languages and how good it is that Ruthie can translate. So I tried to balance, you know, what happens at the beginning of the book with what happens later in the book as Ruthie develops.
Another question from Candace. She loved the way you use food to bridge cultures in Ruthie's neighborhood. And was this a contributing factor in your choice to include recipes at the end of the novel?
Yeah, so the recipes are in the paperback edition, and so when the paperback was coming out, you know, we were trying to think of something fun, like a bonus to add to the book in this new edition. And it was suggested to me by one of the editors, like, oh, how about some recipes? And I said, oh, I was thinking of the same thing. And so decided to put food there, the flan, my mother's amazing flan recipes, and then my grandmother's cookies, the quijeles, these cookies, these very hard cookies that she would make to have with tea. So bringing together the Cuban and the Jewish traditions, even in the recipes, I wanted to sort of just show that, and, you know, just in a very soft kind of way, but to add it in there. So food appears that way. There's also an arroz con pollo at the beginning of the book, but there's also the guava pastries, and then the samosas at the beginning of the book as well. And, you know, and Ruthie and Ramu each bringing different foods, you know, from their families and sharing them with each other. So I think food is a very, very important way of communicating one's culture. So I wanted to show that. And it's also very, very kid-friendly. I was just at an event on Monday night, and one of the librarians actually made the quijeles. She made the cookies, and they came out wonderfully. It was a huge bowl of these cookies. And so it's a nice way to pass on some of the cultures that are discussed in the book.
And Rosa says she's sitting here with two of her daughters. One is 14 and the other one is 10. The
Oh, wow.
read your book and loved it.
Oh,
She says she's currently reading the book with her 10-year-old. And so I'm wondering, what do you hope those girls take away from this book? What are the lessons?
wow. Well, you know, I also spoke at a mother-daughter group this past year in Chicago, and I thought that was so beautiful that mothers and daughters were reading the book together, because it's very, very much of a mother-daughter book. I think that was one of the ways I was thinking about it as I was writing it. So I would just love for girls to take away some of Ruthie's strength and hope and bravado, and also her love of books and reading, which is something that Ruthie learns in the process of getting better and recovering. So the importance of education for girls, the importance of reading, the importance of nurturing yourself in different ways through the arts as well, listening to stories also, because Ruthie's also a story listener. She starts listening to her grandmother's stories, and that also makes her grow as a thinker and as a writer. So I think to really try to nurture oneself in all those ways, through reading, through books, through listening to stories, making art, caring about other people's suffering, not just your own. I think that's another, you asked me about lessons before, and I think that was another lesson that I wanted to be there in the book, at least in a subtle way, that Ruthie's suffering, but she comes to learn that she's not the only one who suffers. So I think also to develop that understanding and caring for others as well.
Okay, great. Well, Ruth, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for being here.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.
And thank you so much. I just wanted to end and let you all know that if you're interested in exploring more about Cuba and you're an educator, please join us. I just shared in the chat box on the right, Tulane University has an annual institute for educators to Cuba. This year it's June 22nd through July 6th. And the link is there. And I also just wanted to let you know that the 2019 Américas Award winners will be announced at the end of April. So find us on Facebook. But thank you so much, Ruth and Carolina.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Have a good evening. Good night.
Good night.